Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, my co-host and husband. How are you doing today, Omar?
I'm doing good. Your intro was a little different today. You're like, welcome to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm doing good. I'm a little tired today. I feel like work has been very busy, and with the holidays and stuff coming up, I get a little anxious and stressed. But other than that, I'm good. How are you doing? How are you really doing?
I'm doing well. I feel like things have just been going really well the last few months. I can't remember if I've talked about this in the podcast recently already, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I feel like my hormone health has been in a really great spot lately. I know I have talked about this on Instagram, so some of you may be familiar, but I just feel like I found a really great sweet spot with my body, and things have been feeling really good, so I'm very appreciative for that. But, today I actually want to talk about something that's been on my mind personally, because this is something that I am always ongoing, working on optimizing and just maintaining optimal. And I know it's something you've been working on as well. So I thought it'd be a good topic for us to bring to the podcast this week. And that is insulin resistance.
Dun, dun, dun.
I love how you always bring the dun, dun, dun after anything slightly negative.
It's not negative. It's just more or less like, yes, I struggle with insulin resistance. So when I see it, because I think it's something that's like, well, how do you manage it? How do you fix it? What even is it? Mm-hmm. When I saw it this morning, I was like, I'm excited because I'm dealing with some insulin resistance myself as a guy. And so it just gets me exciting. So I always drop the dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. Well, I feel like, so insulin, it's a hormone, and I feel like the hormone that people least want to talk about. And yet it's probably like this kind of secret little hidden gem, I think, for a lot of people in their weight loss journeys and or hormone healing journeys, is really getting insulin and blood sugars optimized. I think it's something that a lot of people are missing. And like you said yourself, you kind of have a little bit family history of diabetes and issues overall with blood sugars. In my journey, I've done quite a bit of work on my blood sugars. And so it's something that, kind of hits home for both of us as well. And it's something we've worked on with a lot of clients throughout their journeys too. Kind of starting from the beginning here, you might be coming to this episode very familiar with the hormone insulin. You might have no idea what insulin really is. So
I'm kind of on the second one part of that, because like I've heard it and it's trendy and it's I don't know, it's popular right now, but I don't even know what it is. So I'm dive in. I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, so essentially, the way that your body kind of operates when it comes to blood sugars is when you consume food, especially carbohydrates, but really any food in general to an extent, what your body does now that food is getting broken down into blood sugar, into blood glucose. Glucose is kind of the form of sugar in the body. So that glucose is in your blood, and that's why it is called blood sugar, blood glucose.
Got it.
So the levels, the amount of sugars in the blood is going to rise as you eat that food, and it's released into the bloodstream. Think of like your bloodstream as like the highway within the body of getting things where they need to go, right? So it's almost like you're in, LA on rush hour, and suddenly you ate this big high carb meal, and like suddenly traffic hits really hard. That's kind of what's happening in the bloodstream of the body, is like, whoa, traffic is hitting. Those blood sugars are going up. Our bloodstream is getting filled with sugar right now, with glucose.
You know that song Rascal Flatts, the Life is a Highway, Life is? That's what came to mind, just FYI.
So meanwhile, you're just like not listening. You're just like a little jukebox in your head.
Yeah.
So essentially, that's what's kind of happening with our sugars, right? Well, obviously, I think a lot of people would understand this. We don't want to have a lot of sugar just floating around in our bloodstream. It needs to go somewhere. It needs to serve a purpose. So how does it get where it needs to go to be able to serve the purpose it needs to serve? Well, the pancreas, so the organ, the pancreas, its job is it's going to detect when our blood sugar goes up and when we need to be releasing insulin. So your pancreas is now saying, okay, where blood sugars are going up, let's release the insulin, release the hounds. And so what's going to happen? Insulin is kind of almost more like the taxis or the Ubers that are going to go and like pick up all the people and get them where they need to be. So it's going around, it's in the bloodstream, it's picking up the blood sugars, and it's taxiing them to where it needs to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I'm following.
Where does the blood sugar need to go? Well, really, it has a couple of options here. So kind of the first and foremost thing that would happen is you're actually going to burn those sugar as energy. Sugar is actually your body's number one preferred fuel source. It is going to be burned as energy. So insulin needs to take the, taxi around those little blood sugars through the bloodstream, drop it into the cell where it can be actually used as energy, converted into energy. But what happens when we don't need more energy? What happens when we have a lot of sugars and like we're kind of basically like the cells are like, nope, we're good, we're full, we don't need more energy, right? Well, it's got to take it somewhere. So that's where some of it gets stored into basically like a savings account. So that's what's going to happen is it's going to be put into the muscle or the liver as glycogen. And that's going to be the storage form of glucose. So now it's being converted into this thing called glycogen and stored in the liver or the muscles to be used for later. So are we following?
Yeah, no, I gotcha.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's kind of like option number 2, right? But what happens when those storage kind of units basically are filled up? So it's like
when the glycogen units are filled up. Is that what you're saying?
No, not the glycogen units, not necessarily. The kind of ability for the liver and the muscles to store the glycogen.
Oh, got it. The bank accounts are like through the roof.
Exactly.
Got
Yeah.
it.
Almost think of like the sugars being like these little guys where it's like, they just like flooded the highways because they're like, woo, we just made it into town. We got to go somewhere. They all want to go to the cool spot, which is the cell, be burned as energy. But the cells are like, nope, sorry, we're full. No capacity. So then the taxi being the insulin is like, okay, we got to go somewhere else. Let's go to the liver or the muscle. And they're like, okay, cool. It's not like a 5-star hotel like getting burned in the cell is, but we'll take this 4-star
We'll take
Airbnb.
a Holiday Inn.
Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah. So then, it gets dropped off there. But now they're like, no, we're full. No vacancy left here. So what happens to the remaining? Well, now that remaining blood sugar is going to get stored as body fat.
Got it.
I want to be very, very clear here as well. As I'm explaining it, I am oversimplifying things to make sure that it is really like easy to follow and understandable. There is some more nuance to that process, but I want to kind of explain that so that you understand the role that insulin plays in our blood sugars, in our regulating this system, this feedback system within the body of ultimately burning energy or storing energy in different forms, which is muscle or body fat. So what happens then when we go through periods of low blood sugar? We talked about what happens when blood sugar gets high and insulin gets released, right? Well, next question would be, what happens when blood sugar gets low? And this is a natural thing that's going to happen, obviously, when we go through periods of fasting. That might just literally mean from dinner time to breakfast time, like an overnight fast. It could be, more of like an extended fast for somebody who's doing something like intermittent fasting or fasting protocols, things like that. Could literally just be the time between meals, or if we're exerting a lot of energy in exercise and, we've used up the blood sugars that we have available and we need more. The cells are actually like, hello, we need some more blood sugar over here. What happens? Well, the storage form needs to be released. How does it know that it needs to be released? Well, there's another hormone, and basically think of this as like the kind of opposite of insulin, if you will, and that hormone is glucagon. So glucagon is going to be
That's
basically...
a cool name, glucagon. It sounds like a Power Ranger.
Yeah, well, that's kind of maybe what's happening here. We're basically like in a Marvel movie, and you got insulin and you got glucagon, and they're just like battling.
But the people that are listening to this episode are gonna be like, "Are Vanessa and Omar on like drugs? Like, what are they talking about?" Like,
no, they are thinking
traffic,
right now, wow,
Marvel.
blood sugars have never been
so
more
cool.
interesting in my life, and they are so stimulated and bought into this right now. I am willing you to be stimulated and bought into this episode right now. But okay, so glucagon, it's getting released, and what's happening is now it's going to stimulate to the liver to release that stored glycogen to be used as energy, right? So that helps get our blood sugar back up. So basically, it's just this whole like feedback mechanism, this whole feedback loop of the body wanting to maintain a certain level of sugars within the blood. If it gets too high, it releases insulin to get that extra, basically the excess out.
Carried out.
If it gets too low, it releases glucagon to raise the levels up.
Got it.
So now we kind of understand like the mechanisms of what is happening in the body, like what's actually going on. We need to understand that part to get into what actually is insulin resistance. So now imagine that maybe you're someone who follows like a more standard American diet where you're eating a very like high carb diet, lower protein, not like a very nutritious diet. Maybe you're somebody who does a lot of intermittent fasting and you're prompting your body to release a lot of blood sugars. Maybe you're somebody who's high stress. Stress causes blood sugars to be released. Maybe you're somebody who just doesn't really understand nutrition very well. And maybe you think like, oh, I'm eating really healthy, but your meals are actually not very optimized for blood sugars. And we're going to talk about that as well. Well, in any of these instances, if our blood sugar is just getting high consistently, it's getting too high, what your body is doing, that pancreas is just like, boom, insulin, insulin, insulin. Like it just keeps on getting released. Well, the more insulin that's getting dumped into the system, the more it's getting released, the more the cells start to almost become like, they start to almost feel like they just can't even use the insulin anymore. The cells start to become resistant to the insulin. Okay. So now this insulin, where its job is to get it into the cell to be burned as energy, it can't do that very well anymore. It can do it a little bit, but it's just not very well. Like the cells are basically just like not connecting with insulin. The insulin's like a message that's being sent, and it's just, over and over again being like, message can't be sent. Mm-hmm. How annoying is that when you like lose service and you're trying to send a message and it just keeps being like
the worst.
Did not go through. Message did not go through. That's what's happening with your body. The insulin is the message. Your pancreas keeps on sending that message. It does not go through. That's basically what we're referring to when we talk about insulin resistance. Are we following?
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And again, for me, this is very interesting because I recently went through something like this where I'm not like, I wouldn't consider myself overweight. I'm in decent shape, but I was having a little bit of trouble with like, especially like the stubborn like belly fat. And so part of it is I always love sweets and I love sugar and I love all these things. And so as I started working with my coach, he was like, yeah, like, you're 32 and you're showing some signs of insulin resistance. So we've got to do all of these things. And I'll be honest, I haven't been as disciplined and dedicated as I need to be to it. But the biggest thing has been, over time, he was like, you're going to have a hard time with metabolism, with losing weight. If we keep going this and then down the road, you might become pre-diabetic or diabetic if you don't fix this. So that's where I'm like, all right, I need to focus and I need to get this under control because otherwise it leads to more serious health concerns down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, gotta cut yourself some slack here too. I mean, you're 32 Thanks. And the reality is, you and I are significantly more in shape than your average kind of, 30 to 32-year-old, right? But the reality is so many people struggle to lose weight and start to find themselves in this position of just like, oh, well, it's just, I'm in my 30s or I'm in my 40s and it's just kind of like it runs in my family to gain weight. And they don't realize that they're not just like, I'm just getting older and it just runs in my family. It's more of the fact that probably the habits that create insulin resistance run in the family. And that's where over the course of time, we're building more and more insulin resistance to where now we start to develop these issues with time, with age. So it's not the aging process itself. It's just the fact that you spent more and more time building this resistance to insulin.
Well, that's my point is, we're active. We, are in the gym 3-4 days a week. I can't speak. Our diet, for the most part, is pretty dialed in. And so that's why when I saw that from my lab work, I was like, oh gosh, I'm insulin resistant. I'm like, so I can only imagine like how frustrating that is for like the average person that isn't as active or like nutrition might not be as dialed in. So I know how much of a pain in the butt this can be.
Yeah. So insulin resistance in and of itself, not only does this lead to, excess body fat stores because you're going to be more prone to building body fat, to storing body fat if we cannot get that sugar into the cell. We are only can get so much into our liver and our muscle stores. And so the excess, what happens, gets stored as body fat like we talked about. So that's where now we start to add more and more body fat. It's especially common to add body fat in your midsection when we are insulin resistant, which is where a lot of people start to get more of like that apple shape, start to get more and more of a belly developing over time. Very common even like postmenopausal because there's a lot of hormonal things that can lead to insulin resistance as well. It's going to lead, if we develop insulin resistance, you're probably going to start to notice less energy overall because again, like we talked about, that ability to actually burn sugar in the cell, that is at a very basic level what produces energy in the body. So you're probably going to feel like you have lower energy levels or just inconsistent energy levels overall. you're going to find that you have a harder time losing body fat. So it's like you could probably go into a calorie deficit, but it just doesn't work as well as maybe it does for other people, or maybe it has in the past for you. And that is going to come down to, again, your body's just not very efficient at burning body fat. So you might find that you even lose muscle more than you lose body fat because your body has trouble with burning the body fat. You might find that you have like other health issues that start to develop. So of course, the longer this goes on, the worse it gets, the more we set ourselves up for other issues, to where it may not be that you get like an insulin resistance diagnosis. It might be that you get these much bigger diagnoses, and those actually started from insulin resistance that was never really taken care of. At the end of the day, this kind of blood sugar regulation mechanism is very, very important for overall managing inflammation in the body. So you'll just find that you're going to be building up a lot of inflammation in the system, and that buildup of inflammation is what is going to lead to lots of health issues, immune system issues, and all kinds of things.
Can I add something to that really quick?
Of course.
Because you mentioned, sometimes, the wrong workouts or stress can trigger a lot of insulin resistance and inflammation. So what I've seen this happen in a lot of the calls that we have with clients is they're like, I'm working out 5 days a week. I'm doing HIIT workouts and I'm super stressed. I'm in a caloric deficit. And what they don't see is that they're literally building the mountain of stress, because if you're going into things with an underlying level of inflammation and then you're adding a caloric deficit, and then just, life is stressful and you're doing the wrong workouts, it's like stress on top of stress. I'm like, what do you think your body's going to do? And they're like, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way. But anyways, just wanted to highlight that point.
Yeah. And we're going to dive even more into blood sugars in next week's episode. And
so tune in, kids, for next week's episode.
We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to kind of, in this episode, really explain insulin resistance and really help people understand insulin resistance specifically. Really, like, you probably will find that if you have insulin resistance, you're probably going to also have other hormonal imbalances. It could be thyroid issues, sex hormone issues, cortisol issues, because really blood sugars are, and insulin as a whole is really a big part of kind of the regulation of these different hormonal systems. So they're all going to be affected, which is also why you'll see like a lot of these symptoms are shared across various issues within the body. You might hear like, oh, low energy. That's a common symptom for a lot of things, right? Well, that's because they're all probably, you're rarely just going to have one thing going on. That really doesn't ever happen. It's just more of like the extent to which these different things are happening in your body. But long term, you're probably going to notice that now you have, high triglyceride levels. You might notice lower HDL cholesterol, which we don't want. You're probably going to notice higher blood pressure. Really, you're just going to be on the path towards metabolic syndrome, which is kind of the baseline for things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, a lot of these much bigger health issues. This is kind of like the stair steps to get there, starting with insulin resistance, then metabolic syndrome, then you end up with type 2 diabetes or heart disease or stroke or other, similar types of health issues. And obviously, nobody wants to be dealing with that, right? So that's where we got to make sure we start to understand the signs and symptoms of, are my blood sugars off? Is my insulin possibly off? Am I possibly insulin resistant at this point, or on the path to insulin resistant at this point? So what are some kind of common signs? We've already started to talk about some of them a little bit here. Big one is just having trouble losing weight. If you're not able to effectively burn body fat, that is probably meaning that you are essentially just burning sugars. You have high blood sugars in the body because your body, that insulin, that taxi, is not able to get the blood sugars where it needs to go into the cell to be burned. So you just have this high level of sugar that your body is just like, well, let's just keep using this sugar. There's no need for us to burn body fat. Instead, let's keep storing body fat. Let's keep putting the sugar into more and more body fat. You're probably going to find that you have possibly like a bigger appetite, or at least you have a lot of cravings. Like you mentioned, Omar, you definitely have a sweet tooth. You always have talked about how like you always struggled with sugar cravings. Super common with insulin resistance. You're gonna have a lot of sugar cravings, and you probably find that even having like that, sweet something after meals just never really quite gets rid of the sugar cravings. It's just like a thing that you always have. Very, very common. You might find that you feel more tired after meals, especially bigger meals. A healthy, effective metabolism and body can handle bigger meals, can use that fuel effectively and take it where it needs to go to be used as energy. If your body is not able to process that higher amount of glucose, which can be coming from, the carbs and the proteins and different things in the meal, Well, what's going to happen? You're going to have these like energy just like swings to where you just have this like dump of like, gosh, I feel like I need to take a nap. You might find that you have actually more frequent thirst and urination because, again, this stuff affects a lot of different systems within the body. You might notice that, again, you have more hormone problems. PCOS is a big problem that can start from insulin resistance, as well as estrogen dominance is a very common problem that can come from insulin resistance. I myself have struggled with estrogen dominance quite a bit. That's like a common thing that always wants to like make its way back for me a little bit, which is why, like I started talking about in this episode, I am consistently working on always just managing my blood sugars because it's not something where it's like, whoop, optimized it, done. Let me go back to what I was doing before. It's just this constant management of overall healthy blood sugar balancing habits, which, to be clear, are really not that hard. It's really a very simple kind of just lifestyle approach. And we're going to talk about that more as well. But ultimately, what's kind of happening a lot of times that causes these hormonal imbalances, just to give you guys a little bit more of the science background, because personally, I hate it when people just give like very generic, like, oh, this causes this, and don't really explain why, right? Well, so what's actually happening is when you have elevated insulin levels, what that's going to do is it's going to stimulate to the ovaries to produce excess androgens. So androgens, that's ultimately going to lead to more testosterone. Androgens become testosterone. Well, that androgens can also aromatize into estrogen. So you're probably going to find that you either end up with high testosterone or high estrogen. And that's where ultimately you're going to end up with probably either PCOS or estrogen dominance. Two very common things we see coming from those with insulin resistance. In men, you're probably going to appear more estrogenic, meaning like men start to be a little bit more womanly shaped, of a little bit more like
man boobs.
Yeah, man boobs, storing body fat more kind of like in the belly and the hips. Very much like, how often do you just kind of see that if you go to Disney World and kind of look around at like older men?
Why do you have against Disney? Why Disney?
I don't know. It's just like a comment.
Just Disney.
It was the first place that came to mind of like, you'd be around a lot of people.
Yeah.
You'd probably see a lot of different body types. And again, this is not...
We're going to get shut down by Disney.
This is not criticizing body types by any means. It's more so just helping you kind of feel empowered and understanding that the way that your body takes shape is actually very much determined by your hormones and by the way that you manage your health and all these different hormones like insulin. You might find that, whether or not you have PCOS or estrogen dominance, you might just find that you have a lot of symptoms of hormonal imbalances. Maybe you have a lot of PCOS or just irregular PMS, or irregular cycles, or acne, or sleep disturbances, and like things like that as well, to where you might already be thinking like, gosh, I think my hormones are off. Well, let's also think about your blood sugars here. You might notice changes in your skin. So like as this gets really bad, you'll often see that people have a lot of acne. They have possibly even like skin tags or skin pigmentations changes.
I didn't know that was a sign of it.
Mm-hmm. That's where like a lot of times with type 2 diabetes, you'll typically see people have a lot of skin tags. That's been kind of the development from insulin resistance.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what should you really look for on labs if you want to kind of check on labs to see, is there possibly some insulin resistance going on here? Well, there's kind of three main values that we're looking at when we want to kind of assess for insulin resistance. Of course, especially for like more of the functional health approaches that we take here, we're looking at a lot of things and kind of putting all the pieces of the puzzle. So it's not just these three values that we're looking at, but these are three ones that you can specifically look for to kind of just assess where your body might be at. So the first one being, should be no surprise, but blood glucose. So your fasted blood glucose, you're probably getting that tested if you are doing like a normal kind of just general blood panel. Typically that's going to be on there. So what should your fasted blood glucose look like? Now, this is where, pay attention here, this is where a functional health approach is going to look different from your conventional medicine approach. Conventional medicine has a much wider range of what is considered normal. And that is also why so many people end up with these health issues, is because they're not actually catching it when they should be catching it. They're just being told, yep, that looks good, that's normal, you're good to go, until eventually it crosses over into conventional medicine, kind of pre-diabetic, diabetic ranges, and then it gets addressed. But at that point, it's a lot harder to undo as opposed to if you undid it in those other ranges. So what are those ranges? Well, for us, when we take a look at this from a kind of functional health perspective, what we want to see is between 70 and 90 on that blood glucose rating. Ideally, like even more, we'd want to get it even tighter between 75 and 85. But low 70s to high 80s is really what we would consider like functionally optimal. Now, the difference, if you go and get this tested with your doctor, and if you had a reading in the 90s, you could even be like 99, they would still tell you you're normal, you're good to go. But when we see something in the 90s, to us, that is actually functionally borderline, is kind of what we would label that as, to where you are trending towards insulin resistance, and we need to start working on blood sugars now before it gets worse and it gets harder to kind of unravel at that point. Basically, it's like if you're trying to undo a knot in a string and you're just like, oh, it's fine, it's in the 90s, we're good. But then what's happening is it's getting tighter and tighter. Now you try to address it. When it's even tighter, it's gonna be a lot harder to undo that knot, right? If we get into more of the 100 to 125 range, that is technically considered pre-diabetic. And then if you are over 125, that is technically considered diabetic. So that's the first kind of reading you want to look at. Your second reading is your A1C, which is kind of an average blood glucose level over the past 90 days. And so what we're looking at for there is from a functional medicine perspective, we actually want to see a reading between 4.1 to 5.6. That's going to be what we consider kind of normal at that point.
And that's a percentage, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, 5.7 to 6.4%, that is going to be pre-diabetic range, and over 6.5 is going to be diabetic. Insulin, kind of similar thing here. This is where the conventionally normal ranges are very much going to be different from our functional ranges that we're looking at. So conventionally normal is a very wide reading here. And again, this is a big problem. This is a big reason why a lot of people develop insulin resistance, because it's not being caught on labs. And so if you go and get your insulin checked with your doctor, what they're probably going to look at is they're going to say, okay, is it between 2.6 and 24.9? Very big range there. They're like, okay, that's what we're looking for. So you could be at a 23, 24 insulin reading, and they're going to tell you that it's normal and that you're good. Go, keep doing what you're doing. You're fine. You're going to be like, why am I struggling to lose weight? Why do I not feel great? Why am I struggling with these things? Well, it's because your doctor's telling you that your insulin is normal when it is not. It is high. What we want to see with a functional medicine approach is actually below 7. And even better, kind of like our goal to optimize it is actually going to be right around a 4. How different is a 4 from a 24? Very different.
Or just the range. I mean, from 2.6 to 24.9, you're like, well, like, what if I'm like a 10 or 15? Like, that's crazy.
Exactly. Now, your fasted blood glucose, your A1C, your insulin, looking at those on labs, super important, very, very helpful. And especially, I hope me kind of giving you those ranges is going to help you feel a little bit more empowered to go advocate for yourself and to look at your own labs. But it still does not necessarily tell the whole story. You could still look pretty good on those, or maybe one of them is kind of off, and yet you might not be in a great state of health, because those are just one reading at one point in time. This is where actually with a lot of our clients, what we'll do is actually monitor blood sugars using a blood sugar monitor, a glucose monitor. This is something that, Omar's been having a great time with this year.
I'm shaking my head because pricking your fingers, it hurts so bad. I think I'm a baby,
Well, he also does it way sharper than he needs to do because he just wants to get a ton of blood out. I'm like, you do a really light prick and just get a tiny bit of blood. No,
because if you do a light prick and then I'm like squeezing my finger to get blood out and I have to like squeeze and squeeze.
You're
I'm
impatient.
Like, no, I'm like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it once. I'm like, I want blood out to be able to measure it. So.
Well, I'll just say that when I do it, I barely feel it and just squeeze out a little bit of blood and I'm good to go.
No.
But I will also say too, a lot of people I know do not like the process. I don't love the process myself. This is where for my own journey, when I was really working on blood sugars, which was more like 2023, early 2023, what I actually did was I wore a continuous glucose monitor for a few months there. That's really helpful because then you don't have to be like doing all these constant readings. I actually, since like I said at the beginning of the episode, I am wanting to bring back in a little bit of management around my blood sugars. And to be honest with you, it's not that I even like hate checking my blood sugars. It's just inconvenient. And you probably feel this way too, but it's like, you got to get your reading in the morning, and then you want to try and time it for 2 hours post meal. So like after you finish your last bite of food, set a timer for 2 hours and check it again. But for myself, I'm like, I feel like I'm always working. I'm on calls, different things. And it's like my 2 hour timer goes off and I'm in the middle of a call. I can't be like, oh, hold on, I got to go check my blood sugars. So that's why a continuous glucose monitor can be super helpful. We actually get them through, so we have a medical team that we work with. So that's why we're able to get them for, ourselves, clients, when needed, of course. And also helpful because then it gets covered by your insurance, depending on your insurance. But that's where, again, like knowing kind of just about this stuff and that these are tools that you can use is very, very helpful. So kind of same ranges, same thing. We just want to check it first thing when you wake up. You could drink some water first because hydration will affect your blood sugar as well. But, kind of right when you wake up so that you don't necessarily go and like do a bunch of things, and stress, again, can affect blood sugar levels. So then check it then. And then after each of your meals, check it 2 hours. You could do that maybe 1 to 2 days a week and kind of see and just watch the trends. And that's going to be incredibly helpful data of what's going on in your body and tell you a lot more than just the one-time lab reading will. So I do highly recommend that if you suspect that something is going on with your blood sugars. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a lot we can do to manage blood sugars based on our habits, how we're eating, our nutrition, our training, our lifestyle, a lot of different variables here. So we're actually going to cover that fully in depth in next week's episode. So definitely stay tuned for that, because if you suspect that there might be anything going on with your blood sugars, or you're just someone who wants to optimize your health, feel your best, be able to get lean and feel really good, this is 100% something that you should be doing. So if you're not already, make sure you subscribe so that you catch next week's episode, and go ahead and share this with a friend so you can spread that good information. Thanks for listening, you guys.
Bye, everybody.